So my name's Linda Atkins. I actually wear two professional hats. I'm a medical practitioner working in women's health in prenatal, and I am also a writer. And I started writing quite late in life. I turned 60 a couple of weeks ago, but I only really started writing again after stopping as a teenager in the last 4 years. And since then, writing has become more and more of a passion for me. And so I exist on a tightrope between my two worlds as a medical practitioner and as a creative, which I find intensely satisfying.
This is so interesting to me because I feel like I keep meeting more and more doctors who also write, who are also authors. What do you think draws those two things together?
It's an interesting question. I suppose if you looked at the number of people who are doctors per se, only a very small proportion of those tend to be writers. And I think they've probably come at it from fairly oblique paths because certainly when I was trying to get into medicine, you were strongly rewarded by universities for having a science bias, a mathematical, physics, chemistry bias. And the profession itself is very strongly science based. So on one hand, you have a number of people who uh, don't do particularly well in English. And when I was doing medical school all those years ago, the average medical student was doing 4 unit maths, and the average mark that they were getting, because I asked around in English, was only about 70%, which for a bunch of 96% plus achievers was pretty low. But there was always the odd artist who snuck into medicine on, like I did, on the basis of very high marks in English and history. And I think, you subjugate that part of yourself in the medical profession because it is so science driven and it's so all absorbing. But then, sort of in your 30s and 40s, and in my case, mid 50s, the art bursts out again.
Hmm.
And some of the better writers in Australia are doctor writers, but the great majority of doctors are just doctors.
Yeah. Thank you for that deep dive. I am always fascinated by these things, like what brings people to this. Because I feel like I know quite a few lawyers and doctors who have become authors. Um, so thank you for answering that. Can you tell me a little bit about how, so you're juggling writing and being a doctor. How do you have a very strict routine for your writing work? How do you fit it into your life?
I think this is one thing that us medical types sort of do have an advantage of if we are creatively driven. Um, Medicine is a high intensity, high performance, high expectations line of work. And rain, hail, or shine, sick or well, you get in there and you do your thing. And that process is also rewarded when you're a writer because, particularly when you're trying to write novels, which are really long, full length manuscripts, I think a level of perspicacity is most definitely required, and our training and our work lives sort of reward that kind of drivenness, and that's why I think a lot the doctor writers that make it sort of to the top are actually really good writers and often quite prolific.
Thank you for sharing that. So, but do you have a routine for?
Oh, yes, I do have a routine. So as writing's become more and more important to me, with the support of my workplace, it's an all-female workplace, so it's really cool. I've actually decreased my working hours, and then on the days that I don't work, every day that I don't work, pretty much I get up and do at least some writing. And I don't do that because I feel like driven to do it. I actually do it because I want to do it, because I feel like I have two halves, and that half tends to be quite rewarded by sitting down and doing it. But on the days I'm working as a doctor, I don't write, no.
Mm. You said you came into or came back to writing about 4 years ago. What was it that drew you back into it?
It was the craziest thing. There was this big family secret that we sort of had, and that I had kept after I sort of got a divorce from my first husband, and but we had kids together, and I didn't want to let that secret out. And I kept it for years and years and years. And then one day I thought to myself, completely out of the blue, if I don't tell one other person this secret that doesn't know me, I think I'm going to die. So I sat down and wrote an essay about it and sent it off to the Calibre Prize. And it was longlisted. I've just forgot about it. I wrote this essay in 2 sessions, sent it off, felt embarrassed by the thought of it, forgot about it. And then they got back to me about 4 months later and said, "Oh, you're longlisted." I was like, "Oh, great. Okay. I hope it doesn't get shortlisted." And it did. So then I had to go and sit and tell my big family secret to everyone, and no one cared. And I guess I was bitten by the bug by then.
Excellent. And um, what was the feeling of going back into writing after being away from it so long? Was it literally just wanting to tell this, to write this secret out, or was it your hand was just itching to get going and start telling stories again?
It was, I always had, like, I wrote a bit as a teen and had some success as a teenager in that high school writing scene. And then it was sort of subjugated for all those years as I worked and raised the kids. And then once I started, it was a little bit like pulling the plug out of the sink and all the water goes gurgling down. There was 30 years of words all jammed up wanting to come out. But I had no craft then because I
Mhm.
hadn't written for 30 years. So I've had to learn my craft on the fly.
Mm. And how have you done that? Have you done courses or just
Well,
learning on the run?
I've learned on the run.
Yeah.
I've read a bazillion books. I sent a lot of short stories out to start with. And, for the first year, like, got nothing. And I was just about to give up. And then a couple of little successes came in. And then more. And it almost seems like there's a critical mass where you think, okay, maybe I actually can do this. And I started writing manuscripts because what's better than a short story? A long story.
I would also argue that sometimes a long story is easier than a short story. The less words you have, the you know, harder it is to write the story. Um, do you have a favorite of the books that you read on craft?
This is such a cliche, but it was Stephen King's On Writing, to be
Oh, it's my
honest.
favorite too.
Yeah, it's just a classic. And, the thing, his books are a bit hit and miss, but I think, but when they're on, they're on. And he was such a genius at writing about ordinary lives with this sort of creepy undercurrent, where anything might happen, that sort of learned quite a lot from people like that. Like, I'm not the sort of highbrow person that says, "Oh, you've got to read all the classics." I mean, I've read a lot of them, but you learn as much by reading super high quality chick lit or popular fiction because those people are good writers.
Mm, mm. And there's a reason why those books do so well, isn't there? The
Yeah, yeah, I,
mm,
I really think so. I think you can learn a lot about the craft of writing by reading books that you pick up in airports.
mm, mm. Can you tell me a little bit about what your novel is? I
Yeah. Yeah, so it came about because I was taken up by an organisation called Westwards, which is an arts and literacy organisation in Western Sydney. I was a £10 pom. and came out with sort of not a very dysfunctional family to Western Sydney, where I grew up. And amongst the things that they taught us in that year were they had this little collection that they were doing called Bad Western Sydney, which was a crime collection. So I wrote a little crime story about the old street that I grew up on, and a greyhound and a pair of guinea pigs, a revenge gone wrong story. And it was published in Bad Western Sydney, which is the second case, and I was on a panel at its release at the State Library, and Candice Fox was on the panel. And she said, "Oh, so good to see crime, Western Sydney crime, because nobody's ever written a definitive Western Sydney crime novel." And I just sort of looked at her and thought, you know what? Challenge accepted.
Mm.
And so I wrote this crime manuscript, but it's not, it's as much literary as crime. Really, it's about Western Sydney is not well understood, and I'm not sure what the equivalent Victorian places are, but it's this vast, heaving, immigrant, poorly educated, rich but fairly narrow culture that has very well-defined boundaries, and no one's really written about it.
Mm.
So I sort of took the bit between the teeth and wrote about the culture that I grew up in, and I found it super easy.
Mm. Fantastic. Can you tell me a bit about your process? So, when you have your story idea, like, do you just spew out that first draft, or are you cycling back through? Are you a plotter? Are you a pantser? What is your process?
Well, that's really interesting because I'm in the process of changing from a pantser to a plotter. As I'm learning more. The crime novel came out as a pantser thing. It's actually the fourth manuscript that I'd written, but it got me an agent and it got me a book deal, and I'm very, very grateful for that. And it just came out really sort of quickly over about 4 or 5 months. It was a very quick write because it just seemed to write itself, and I pantsed the whole thing. But now we're in the second round of major edits, and I'm realizing, that the editor comes back to you and she says, "Well, what about this? You said this and then you said that." And so I think with certain genres like crime, you've really, even if you do it in retrospect, you've got to do some plotting. So I'm currently surrounded by post-it notes and whiteboards, hammering
Mm.
out irregularities. But my advice to young writers would always be bang out a first draft because you
Mm.
can't edit nothing.
Mhm. Mm. Is there a particular process that you're using to plot it out, or are you?
Um, yeah, whiteboards,
Mhm.
post-it notes, a lot of thought, going for walks, listening to music, and just sort of letting my mind idle on the subject, referring back to the editing notes, but then actually giving myself a little bit of breathing space. And like I'll wake up at 6 in the morning and think, oh, I got it. I think you have to let it's difficult because confidence is a problem. You write this thing and you love it, and then somebody comes back and says, "Oh, there's all these things wrong with it," and then the immediate jump to, I think, of most writers is, "Oh, I can't write. Like I'm a hopeless writer, and I write everything wrong." And there has to be a combination of unconscious rumination and conscious saying, "Look, you wrote that draft.
Mm.
You can write." And so there's a combination of self-belief, I guess, which all writers struggle with, and I'm no exception to that, and letting things sit.
Mm. Mm. From who, what, where do you get your inspiration for your writing?
It's been a bit of a work in progress, because with writers they always say write what you know. But you can write science fiction and write what you know. I mean, what do you know? You know people, you know character, you know what happens when you put characters in a place. But where I'm really starting to draw my inspiration from is writing Western Sydney
Mm.
stories. They're not the only stories I write, but I find them very easy. and very enjoyable. So I probably will. I'm not through that yet. I'll probably write some more Western Sydney stories before I'm done. And I've had some forays into playwriting, but it's a super, super specialized skill. And I'm not sure I'm skilled enough for it, to be honest.
Yeah, it is a very different skill. I believe it's quite useful for teaching yourself a little bit about dialogue.
Yeah, yeah. But painting see, with a writer, you have interiority. Like
Mm.
if somebody's thinking something, I can just write, and she thought. I can't actually do that with a play.
No.
So hats off to playwrights.
Yeah, hats off to playwrights. Absolutely. The your other three that you said you've written four manuscripts. The other three, are they also inspired by the Western Sydney culture, environment?
No, not all of them. I've
Mm.
written a fantasy novel
Mm.
just for fun.
Yeah.
It's just sitting there on my laptop. It was a good way to play with character and learn a bit about characters by just popping them in a backdrop that you have complete control over. I've written a memoir. That was really the first long form manuscript that I wrote. And that got an agent, and it was put out and about, but it it's a difficult sell, memoir,
Mm. Mm.
and particularly when you're an unknown. So I've just sort of parked that. And the other one was about a woman that ran away to Byron Bay to start a garden.
There you go. There you go. I do remember listening to Robert Lucan's talk at, I think it was the launch of his second book, and he was saying that prior to getting published, he wrote a manuscript every year for like 10 years and just popped them in the bottom of the cupboard. I think it's always good for new writers to know that like it's a writing a manuscript is actually part of the training of being a writer. And each manuscript doesn't necessarily need to be published by someone. Um, can you, like, if you were to be chatting with someone who is either new to the creative world, or writing, or is in a kind of a transition stage, what wisdom would you want to share with them that you have found useful?
Think the best novel to work with is one that you finished, is that you actually wrote the whole thing. And what I see quite a lot of, because obviously when you hang around as a wannabe, and so you see other people's process quite a lot as you're all struggling away in the mire, is a lot of people wanting to write chapter one perfectly and doing 10 versions of it. And I'm like, look, you might get to chapter 30 and realize that chapter one actually doesn't suit your manuscript anymore. So I think the best thing you can do is not be too critical of what you're putting down on the page, but get the whole lot out. And then understand that by the time you get to the end, the beginning's probably not going to be all that relevant. And the fun of writing is actually in the fine tuning and the redrafting because you're working with something. You're not trying to complete something, you're trying to refine something. And that is super, super enjoyable. But don't get caught up in making chapters perfect because you won't finish.
Mm-hmm.
If you do that, you'll get to chapter five and then you'll think, oh, chapter one needs to be rewritten. Well, don't. Just write chapter six and think, I'll come back to chapter one. The most common problem I see is people failing to finish their novels. And I guess the second one is you, it doesn't make time to write itself. You have to carve out the time. And I know you've been told this a lot before. Like you can take 7, 8, 10 years to write a novel, but really, if you can devote 2 hours a week to it, you'd probably have a first draft in 18 months. The question is how and where you carve out 2 hours a week. And that's not always easy for people with young children. But if you write forward, not backwards, and if you carve out 2 hours a week, you have a fair chance of getting a first draft within a year and
That
a half.
that is such great wisdom and advice. I concur completely. It's kind of why I got into the game of wanting to help writers, because I kept seeing beautiful writers not finish their manuscripts, and I was frustrated seeing that. I thought, what's going on? Like, why are they not finishing? And I think there was a lot of this, like trying to perfect that sentence, that paragraph, that chapter, the start, and the forward motion, I think, is really important for our brain as well, to go, it knows that it's going somewhere, instead of let's just stay stuck in this bit. And um are you still writing short stories, or are you now just focused on novels?
Another really difficult and interesting question. I have tended to nowadays, I'm tending to write short stories from time to time as sort of filler, um, appetizers, because there's something delicious about a short story. Two writing sessions and you've got a short story. And I've done a lot of flash fiction as well, and that is actually marvelous for fine-tuning your writing skills. 500 words to
Mm.
tell a story. What are you going to tell? What are you going to leave out? So at this stage, at the moment, I'm deeply involved in the edits for my crime novel. And that's going to go on for the next several weeks. And then I'll probably take a couple of weeks off, but I might find myself sitting and banging out a short story or two just as a way of clearing my head.
Mm. Like a palate cleanser.
Yeah, yeah, because to remind myself too that I write because I can't not. And
Mm.
I write because I see the world through that lens now. I've had therapy, and you can have therapy, and therapy is very helpful, but there's nothing like putting down what's important to help you understand what's happening around you. So, yeah, I think writers do tend to write because they can't not write. And now
Mm.
I look back at the 30 years and I'm glad that I didn't write then, because I had to learn enough to write. But at the same time, I don't think that that would ever happen. My biggest fear now is I won't live long enough to say everything I want to say.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. And I think, I agree that when writers are not writing, they're unhappy beings. And, you know, keeping on writing is one of the great things that we can do, that we get to do as writers. Um, do you already have another novel in the works for after this one comes out, or?
Um, yeah, look, the one about the woman that runs away to Byron Bay is actually, I really like it because it's also about grieving. It's about a woman who loses her mother and has a very major series of issues with her relationship with her partner. And it's a dissection of grief. Um, so I'm hoping that I'll have to drag it out again, of course. But when you're first writing, you have to actually pay people to edit your work. And that one's gone through the editing process and it's actually ready to roll. But I've got another crime idea in mind, bubbling away, that I'll probably start this year. Yeah, because crime is, I don't know, I'm not good at police procedurals. It's a little late in the game to try and up your police procedural game when you start in your mid 50s and you haven't spent 30 years reading nothing but crime. But I think I can do howdunits and whydunits.
Hmm.
My
Bit like
publisher,
Agatha Christie style?
yeah, my publisher has called my crime novel a literary crime novel because it's literary fiction disguised as crime.
Nice, fun. When does your book come out?
Um, Probably November.
Hmm.
Eh, but basically, the because we're heavily into the editing process, and I wrote a redraft, and then it came back and it needs more editing, which is what I'm doing at the moment. Um, I think we're going to be on track for a November publishing date.
Mm.
But
Do
I love
do you have a set date yet, or, oh,
no,
sorry, title?
Yes, it's called What We Left Behind.
What We Left Behind. Great title. Tell me, Linda, what does home mean for you and your creativity?
Home is everything, everything. Um, I came from a sort of very dysfunctional family, and I must say a lot of immigrants did. With I've sort of written about this in another essay that immigrants come to a different country because they want more, but underlying that process is being unhappy with what they actually have. So immigrants are sort of selected really for ambition, but also a degree of dissatisfaction, ambition and dissatisfaction. And a lot of the immigrant families had that combination. And so it took many, many years until I was finally able to find a place that feels very safe for me, very comforting. And my children are adults and they are wonderful, wonderful human beings, and we're very close as a family. And so I don't think it's any coincidence that that safety has enabled me to flourish as a creative. And I think when you're not in fight and flight all the time, it's so much easier to write. So to me, home, and now, of course, I've got this nice place that I live in and I love it, and I've got a wonderful family. I'm always at home. I never go out.
Because you have your internal world that is so, it's out there. It's doing crime.
All creatives have a vivid interior life.
Yeah, yeah. And
I,
aren't we lucky to have that?
as a creative, I'm sure you have the same vividness of interaction between your external and your internal worlds.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's fun. Like I would not want to be not creative for that reason. Linda, thank you so much for sharing everything with us. I will have in the show notes links to, can we get a link to the to your essay? Is it published anywhere?
Yeah, it's called Shouting Abortion,
Mhm.
and it's published in Australian Book Review.
Excellent, excellent. And I'm assuming you have a website and socials.
I have socials. I'm at Atkins Audacity on
Yeah.
Instagram. I'm working on my website with my son, but I've been keep getting derailed, but I will have it up at some stage.
Well, we'll put links to you wherever people can find you. And thank you so much for sharing. And I wish you the best for the rest of this kind of editing process and getting the book out. A very exciting year ahead for you. And thanks for joining me on Creative Momentum with Meg.
Thank you so much.